Can you hear me in the back?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Hi, thanks for coming, everybody. Is everybody nice and buzzed? Okay, I don't usually do that with the audience, but that's good. I usually talk for like an hour and a half, so I'm truncating 20 years into like 20 minutes, and I'm gonna cut through a lot of stuff, but I am gonna spend a little bit of time just sort of being a little autobiographical and trying to give you some kind of sense of like overarching themes and linking those to this theme of muse or to muse. So I'll start, and then I understand there's a Q&A after, and those are my favorite, so I like to answer questions. This is the sort of large title of a talk that I give that has to do with my work, that basically has to do with dividing my work into two kind of big categories that have to do with the built environment and things that grow, so building and becoming. So I shoot a lot of things that have to do with the natural environment and a lot of things that have to do with architecture. I almost always start my lecture with this photograph, or these two photographs. These encapsulate a lot about what I do, and it's a good way to kind of introduce the work. So the photograph on the left is the house I was raised in. It's in Beaumont, which is toward Palm Springs from here. That photograph was taken around the year of my birth, around 1974. It was actually done by someone who owned the house before my folks bought it. And the one on the right, my mom just took the other day. So I either do it or I have somebody do it every year as I do these talks, because it's a really great indicator of time. It is a combination of the two things I just talked about, the built environment, which is architecture, in this case a domestic home, the home that I grew up in, and this palm tree, which is just growing and growing and growing, and time changing, etc. A little story about this house, because it kind of comes into play in my work later on, is that it's a slightly unusual home. It's oriented sideways, meaning that there's no front door. So the front door is along the side. It's a sort of strange piece of architecture. When I was a teenager, my parents built this extra room in the back, which is also kind of strange, had a staircase that led to the roof. And so anyway, so I think that I had been thinking about these kinds of things even as a kid. I didn't do any art as a kid. I started making photographs in my college years. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly through these and elaborate on all of them. I know people aren't taking notes, so I'll try not to bore you with this. But I was thinking about this particular topic. So these are some things that I think come up in my work quite a bit. So the first is the vernacular, built, and natural environments, and I already said that before. So architecture would be the built environment, and nature. So I photograph those kind of two things. And these are things that I consider and think about quite a bit. One is the emphasis on the perspective of where my body is in relationship to what I'm photographing. So what does that mean? It means that I'm thinking about where I am and how that image is going to look based on where my body is. So a lot of times my body is in a place that's not like this, right? I'm not almost ever looking from my height at the world straight on. It's either from down below, up high, in some particularly odd location. Not all the time, but most of the time. That's something I think about quite a bit. This is probably the most complicated one. Navigating the tension between the functional and dysfunctional qualities of my subjects. So I'm going to talk about this and show you pictures rather than I try to explain it now, but just have this in your mind that it has something to do with looking at environments and thinking about, does this thing work? Or is there something quite off about it? Or what's wrong with this space? Or things like that. So that's the functional and dysfunctional. this is a little easier to understand. Being genuinely curious and observant of the everyday physical world around me. Gregory mentioned that I'm interested in the banal things in the world. This is often true. I look around a lot for things that I think people overlook. So I spend a lot of time, driving around or walking around, or the combination of those things, and studying things that I think people might just skip, or don't pay much attention to. And the last one that I muse about are making contemplative images that manifest the world I desire. And what that just means is that I make positive work. And what that means is that I make work about the world that I want to see. So I might do tons of digital alteration to it, or I might do almost no digital alteration. But the images I'm making are ultimately about my desire, right? So now we'll talk about images. Okay, so I'm starting way back, and can you give me like a 10-minute warning and a 5-minute warning? Okay, otherwise we're gonna be here. I'm gonna go way back, and I'm gonna go quickly through the old work. This is 2005. Sometimes I'll show you some installation views in galleries because scale is super important in my work. Some of the photographs I make are tiny, some of them are 5 by 6 feet or larger. This was a show I did in New York. And these are houses that are in Los Angeles, in kind of the Valley area. They were originally designed by Richard Neutra, so any architect people in here might know who that is. And the unusual perspective here is that I'm underneath these homes. So I had to gain special access to get these photographs. This is way back before I could, figure out some other way to do it. So I put letters in everybody's mailbox who lived on this street. And the people who let me photograph, this is a funny story, because the guy on the right said yes, and the guy on the left said no. So that works out. And some people ignored me and didn't let me do it. So what's unusual here, and this is maybe, I'll try to talk about this function and dysfunction. So these are houses that exist. They are extremely cantilevered over the hillside. And however, what you're seeing is something slightly difficult to imagine, which is how does this thing do this, right? So the hillside is very steep, the house is straight, but because of my perspective, everything looks kind of tilted. The other big thing is that I digitally removed 3 very large pillars that come down from those points. So the way I use digital technology is always invisible. I don't ever want to make something that's about fantasy. Like I tell people, I'm not interested, Harry Potter's great, but I don't want to make a fantastic world. I want to make a world that's that reaction you all had when I just sort of revealed the secret, that's important. It wasn't this is some ridiculous thing. It looks believable, but strange, right? Actually, when I first made this work, I didn't tell people what I did to it, and I had lots of people architects were like, wow, that building's crazy. So, and that actually has happened quite a bit in my work. So I've sort of learned to enjoy it. And it's kind of interesting because now there's a reversal happening. I built up a reputation for altering my images so much. Now when I don't do anything, people are suspicious, which I love. I actually think that's kind of perfect. Okay, so I'm going to speed up. The same body of work had these photographs of swimming pools from above. I'm actually up. You can see that little blue thing at the bottom. That's me. That's the telescoping device that I'm up in. I'm 30 feet up in this kind of thing that just wavers. And so it was part of the same body of work. It's a little difficult to talk about the intricacies of that in this situation, but you will see this pop up again in more recent work with the skate parks and some interests that I have in that kind of architecture, that sort of volume or sculptural space. Okay. 2010, this is also a show in New York. I did a body of work called Relics, which are lifeguard towers. Everyone in Southern California in this audience has no problem reading that. But this is another interesting situation, is that when I showed these in New York and in Seattle, I actually had a number of people not know what they were. Two reasons. One is if you've never spent time at the beach, and two is that I'm doing things to them that's abstracting them to some degree. I guess people who are very familiar with lifeguard towers ought to notice at least one thing that's unusual. Anybody? No railing or way to get up to it, right? So I've always removed access. So I'm gonna come back to this functional and dysfunctional thing. So now the function of these lifeguard towers is called into question. How are they working? What are they doing? They're all closed up. None of the lifeguard towers are open. This is actually the first one I did in the series. When these first started popping up, I thought they were incredible. They're these like computer designed, just strange fiberglass structures, totally alien. And this one landed on the beach without any signage. And I love that. And so I made sure there was no signage on any of them. So I either removed it or whatever. The other thing that's changed quite a bit is that the structure that's holding them up is almost always really, really reduced and changed so that it probably would not function. Like, that little bit of base on this gigantic thing would not work, but it doesn't read that way right away. Sorry to go so fast. They're all on my website if you want to see them again. How's my time? Good. Okay. Like halfway, maybe. This is a kind of shift in my work in 2013, more of the natural environment. I'm photographing trees and also these things that I call coastline cliffsides. So down south, mostly, there are large areas with really steep cliffs and people who build on the top of the cliffs and then create these very elaborate staircases. And all of these images are kind of foggy at the top, so you don't see the building or the buildings. Anybody seen this in real life? It's kind of incredible. So some of these places I scouted by looking on Google Earth and on this other website where this guy photographs a lot of the coast. This is actually down towards San Diego. It's a pretty famous building. It was in like a National Geographic in the late 60s. I had found it by looking at Google Earth, and I was scouting, and I just see this circle, right, from above, and I was like, what is that thing? Like, you know, you're looking at beach, 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 and then there's this thing. So I think it's nicknamed the Mushroom House. Again, kind of interested in the fact that people don't have, well, this is a fun story too. It's like, when I made these pictures, I would stand on the beach looking at the cliffside, right? So the ocean's behind me. And like joggers would jog by and they'd look at me and they'd look at where I'm pointing and they'd look at the ocean and they'd look back and they couldn't figure out why I was pointing the wrong way, right? Because the picturesque view is the other way, and that's why you have a multi-million-dollar house on the top of that cliff. But of course, my interest is not that. My interest is in something other. Something about this relationship between these built structures and how they relate to the landscape. So intermixed in this show are these photographs of trees. I'll talk very quickly about process. Right around this time, I changed the way I was making work, and I used this process up until now, which is called it's basically, the images are stitched together from many, many different images. So every one of these photographs of a tree is probably between, 30 and 70 individual images, stitching together rows and columns. And that allows me to make them very, very large and have a lot of detail. So I make a lot of images, stitch them together in the computer, and then I can output them. It also allows me to do all sorts of alterations. I can get rid of things in the background, simplify the sky, that kind of thing. Yes, 10 minutes. Oh, good. So does it feel like I'm on speed? Mm-hmm. A little bit? Yes and no? Well, I got 20 minutes. It's like I try to get through it all. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the most recent work. So I'll just speak a little bit about these pieces. This was a series I did of ocean waves, but I couldn't figure out, this is speaking of banal, this was a subject I had a really hard time figuring out how to photograph, because I was like, I mean, how many photographs of the ocean have you seen? You know, like, how can I make them? I mean, a question I ask myself pretty much with every body of work is, how can I make this like you haven't seen before and make it my work, right? That's a really specific kind of question. How can I make this about my expression, my vision? And so this took quite a while to figure out, and I ended up with a really dumb, easy solution, but making very strange photographs. So the way, let's use this one as an example. The way I made this is I made a photograph of pretty much some part of a wave or the ocean, and if you imagine like a normal photograph, I would take just the tiniest sliver, horizontal sliver, all the way across, and cut and crop that, and then I would compress it drastically, so much that it would become vertical. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And so what's interesting about that is that areas in the ocean where not much is changing look basically the same, because it's like photographing the sky and compressing it. There's no information. But areas with a lot of activity became incredibly explosive and interesting and strange. So so this transformative process was kind of, some of the most abstract work I've made too. Okay, this is the most recent body of work. This is what's up right now at the Doyle Arts Pavilion, which is basically down the street. The show's called Empty Vessel. I actually brought Pam. These are available there. That sounds like my alarm. So this is the work that is in that show. It's two interweaved bodies of work. The work for California Concrete, which is this book that I've got out there, that, as Gregory said, Tony Hawk wrote an essay for, and a friend of mine, Peter Zellner, who's an architect, wrote an essay. So it's skate parks, and it's also images of, here we can see a few. On the left, broken vessels, so broken ceramic pieces. The two interwoven bodies of work have to do with kind of how I was thinking about the idea of a vessel. As I started photographing these skate parks and I spent time inside of them, I was trying to ask myself, what are these places? What is this thing? Like, it's not a building. It's not a landscape. What is it? And I was thinking that it's basically just an elaborate bowl. It's an elaborate vessel. And that led me to photographing the ceramics, which I would purchase, break, and photograph the pieces of. So I'll say a couple things about the process here is that you notice that there aren't any people in the photographs. You probably noticed that throughout all the work. I photograph very early in the morning, and skateboarders don't get up very early, so it works out for me as a kind of former skateboarder. I understood that. So getting access to these places is either through just showing up early and getting in, or contacting someone who can let me in, or finding some less legal way of getting access to them. But it works out, and after a while I was able to get more access to more skate parks, especially as the book started to happen. One thing that was super important for me in this work is that I was inside the spaces, not outside. I don't know how many of you have spent any time looking at these things, but from the outside, they're often fenced. You get this kind of little view of some things that you don't really quite understand. It was super important for me to be inside because of the look of the images. I love that they look like landscapes. It's relates much more to your body than if you're on the outside. And they're all up and down the California, all inside California. This is right here in Huntington Beach at the Vans skate park. And I'll go through some of the broken vessels. So the show at the Doyle is open until December. Really helps to see the work in person. It's I try my best to show you what it looks like, but the prints are oftentimes described as looking more like drawings or paintings in person. There's no plexiglass or anything covering the images. And so because of the process I use, they're very detailed and really worth seeing, not in a digital form. So I hope some people get a chance to see the show. How'd I do?
You can talk for 1 more minute.
Nah. I'll just answer questions.